Hey, Three Crosses family, welcome back to the podcast. My name is AJ. I oversee life groups and discipleship here at Three Crosses. And today we've got a very interesting and different conversation in store for you. Today we decided to take the time to pause on a certain topic that comes up in the book of Revelation very frequently. And that topic is, what about the rapture? So if you have rapture questions, hopefully we address them in this conversation. We're so excited to have this. So with that, let's go deeper. Well, joining us to talk about the topic of the rapture. You knew this was coming, Pastor Danny. In the book of Revelation, Pastor Danny Strange, welcome to the rapture conversation.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation with all of you and with you, AJ, too.
And I know we decided to do a little differently here because this is genuinely a pause to talk about a particular topic. If you're a fan of the podcast or have seen us have conversations, we usually just go through verse by verse. But this time, we're breaking it down a little bit systematically, one might say, systematic theology. So help us understand, first of all, the approach to this conversation. What does systematic theology mean, and how do we navigate that as Bible-believing Christians?
Yeah, systematic theology is really kind of looking into the scriptures and pulling out all the different allusions and references to a specific topic, and then systematically finding a way to weave it all together. And so, it's kind of if you're talking about some biblical theology, you might say, hey, what does the book of Genesis have to say about creation? But if you're looking at systematic theology, you might say, hey, what does the whole Bible say about creation? Show me all the verses. Now let's kind of use all of these almost like puzzle pieces and put them together and build a theology on them. And so Revelation is a book that's been interpreted a ton by the use of systematic theology, because there are allusions to what we see in Revelation in Matthew 24, in the book of Daniel, and Ezekiel. Like we've been talking about a lot of these places. And so to interpret Revelation, especially if you're trying to figure out what exactly is happening and where does it fit, we're bringing in all these other texts and taking a look, not just in Revelation biblically, but systematically throughout the entire scripture.
Yeah, and I know we felt like we needed to take a pause here, particularly in this book, because it seems like whenever the topic of rapture, which we're going to be talking about today, whenever that topic comes up and we're reading the book of Revelation, it seems like it begins to break off in different sections. And so we'll talk about that break off. But first, I love the analogy of puzzle pieces. We're always trying to grab the puzzle pieces across scripture. So I want to start with like the primary first puzzle piece here, and that's the timeline. Because I know a big part of the rapture debate is the timing of this all. I think as we were talking offline, there's a bit of assumptions that come into this conversation about the timeline. So could you help us wrap our mind around the timeline and perhaps the futurist leaning in this?
Yeah, so the two most common interpretations of Revelation in terms of timeline, one you mentioned is the futurist timeline. And the futurist timeline believes that most of what we see in Revelation is something that happens in the future. And so John is seeing this vision of things that are soon to take place, the angel says, but that's in the future. And so he's not necessarily seeing things that are going to happen in his lifetime. He might see things that are going to happen in the great war that happens at the end of days, maybe 1,000 years from today. It's in the distant future. The other reading that we've been wrestling with on the podcast, and as we've done the sermon preaching on Sundays, is what's called a preterist or partial preterist timeline, which is a timeline that understands that the events of Revelation, many of them may have happened actually in John's lifetime. And so you look at things like the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and think, man, a lot of the things that we see in Revelation look a lot like what happened around the siege of Jerusalem. Maybe the tribulation is what happened to the early church in the book of Acts, not something that will happen in 1,000 years. And so a preterist view of Revelation is saying, hey, I think that most of what happens in the book of Revelation happened already, and now we're just waiting for the next thing in God's timeline, which is the return of Christ to set up his kingdom. And so there's a whole spectrum of what people believe has already happened, what's yet to happen.
Right.
But those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. Is a full preterist would say most of this stuff already happened, and a full futurist would say, no, all of this stuff is happening in the distant future, or it could happen tomorrow, but it hasn't happened yet.
And so would you say it's fair to say that a futurist reading lends more toward this rapture conversation?
Yeah, I think that most of the people who talk about rapture are people who are in a futurist stream.
Right.
And so, we've gotten a few over the last few weeks, people come and bring Revelation charts to us.
Right.
And most of the time a Revelation chart is created, it's created with a futurist view.
Yeah.
Say, hey, this is what it's going to look like. And I'm talking from our vantage point, saying it's going to happen in the future. Some futurists, the futurists just believe it happens in John's future. So some people say, hey, this happened in the world wars in the 20th century. Some people say, oh, this happened in leading up to the Dark Ages or the Renaissance or these different times in human history, future to John. But most of the leanings when we're trying to build a specific timeline throughout history and interact it with our history here on planet Earth, we're probably talking about a futurist interpretation.
So let's put on our futurist hat here and talk about what we see in the book of Revelation in terms of, you've given us a good timeline, but what exactly would a futurist say to some of the passages we're approaching, in terms of the seals, the trumpets, the bowls, all these things? What is that timeline like? What does the sequence of events look like?
Yeah, the general timeline, not to map it onto any specific year on planet Earth, but the general timeline is at some point the end times is going to begin in a great tribulation. And so the most literal people say there's a 7-year tribulation where all of these things start happening. These wars and rumors of wars is the beginning of the tribulation. Then the sky starts falling as the 7 trumpets start sounding. And then Satan is cast to earth and starts to run rampant. Then there's a midpoint of the tribulation, 3.5 years in. Daniel would say it time, and half a time. In the book of Revelation, it talks about, how many months or weeks it is?
1,260 days.
Yeah, so it's a 3.5 year period
42 months, I think.
that gets us to the midpoint of the Great Tribulation, which is called the abomination of desolation. This abominable thing happens where it all just kind of breaks apart. And then the last 3.5 years is the finishing of the Great Tribulation. And then after that, we see that this millennial period starts where Christ returns, binds Satan, reigns for 1,000 years, and then the eternal state happens after that. So that's what we think of as heaven. And so in terms of an on-earth linear timeline, the next thing that happens in God's events is this 7-year tribulation that has a halfway point with this abomination of desolation at year 3.5. Then we've got the return of Christ, the binding of Satan, the 1,000-year reign in Revelation 20, and then the millennial kingdom where the New Jerusalem comes down in Revelation 21, 22. So that's the timeline.
Yeah, and I think the easiest way to think about these debates is to think through that timeline because there traditionally have been 2 really strong, prominent ideas about the rapture.
The rapture.
So now that we have the timeline, break down the 2 positions on the rapture, and then we'll go one by one breaking them down. So what are the 2 positions based on the timeline that you just gave us there?
Yeah. So first, if you're listening today or watching today and thinking like, I have no idea what a rapture is, rapture is a concept that we see in the scriptures where God's people are taken up to heaven before they die. And so, if you've seen the movie Left Behind or Thief in the Night, there's this idea that the Christians all disappear. They've been raptured. And so the Old Testament kind of version of this is Elijah, who a chariot comes down from heaven, grabs him, and he's whisked away before he dies. And so there's this picture of that in the Old Testament. And then we have these allusions to this rapture of the saints in books like 1 Thessalonians to talk about we're going to meet Christ in the clouds, those of us who are still alive. So there's this idea that some of us, before we die, if we're alive in the midst of these end times, we're going to get sucked off of earth. We're going to meet Jesus in the clouds and return with him without having to face death. And so that's kind of cool. So the 2 major views of rapture, maybe 3, because the rapture is not in the book of Revelation. That word does not exist. And so this is a systematic theology where we've got to realize this thing, if it exists, we've got to map it into Revelation somewhere. And so the kind of the endpoints of the spectrum are people who believe in a pre-tribulational rapture and people who believe in a post-tribulational rapture. So that 7 years tribulation, some people believe that the rapture happens and then the tribulation starts. Post-tribulational, people believe that we go through the tribulation and then we're raptured. There's also mid-tribulational people, which exist at that 3.5 year period.
We'll get to that
or somewhere in the middle. But those 2 views, pre and post, are the major views on rapture.
And if you're wondering, that 1 Thessalonians passage comes from chapter 4, verses 16, 17. It says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and are left will be caught up." And that word rapture comes from the Latin rapio, And so people have zoomed in on that, caught up. We who are still alive and left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we'll be with the Lord forever. And that's like the primary rapture passage. But we see hints of it in John 14, talking about Jesus preparing rooms. And he says in verse 3, if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may also be where I am. So we'll get into a lot of scriptures in this conversation, but we've given the timeline. We have two different positions. I want to just walk through each position, talk about some of the scriptural support, some of the strengths and weaknesses of each one. So in terms of the timeline, not order of importance or order of strength of belief, all right? Let's start with the first one, pre-tribulation rapture. So the pre-tribulation rapture is the one saying, hey, we're actually not going to go through this tribulation, the 7 years. The church is going to be raptured or meet Jesus in the air, taken away from that. And yet the one thing I know about the pre-tribulation rapture is that there is this coming at the beginning where the church is met, or the church meets with Jesus in the air. And then there's a second coming where Jesus goes to earth with the heavenly hosts and begins that great white horse rider scene where the battle of Armageddon comes. So there's like a coming at the beginning and the coming of an end, split into two different arrivals of Jesus. Do we see scriptural support for that? What is the evidence there?
Yeah, and I'm glad you said it that way, because that is kind of what distinguishes that pre-tribulational rapture view, is that the second coming of Christ is split up into two parts. So if you're a post-trib rapture person, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to be caught up in the air with Christ at his second coming. If you believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, we get caught up in the air with Christ as he comes for us, but then there's a 7-year period where we're just kind of waiting, or we go back, or I don't know what we do, and then we come back with Jesus in the return of Christ, live in this, he comes back a second time. So yes, scriptural support. I think the biggest thematic scriptural support for this is the idea that as God's people, he promises that we are spared from the wrath to come. And so if the Great Tribulation is the beginning of God pouring out his wrath on planet Earth, part of the suggestion there is that the church of Jesus, us, we don't have to experience the wrath of God because we've been saved by Jesus. And so we believe that if we're a pre-tribulational rapture person, we're spared from the wrath, but also people get saved during this period of great tribulation.
Right.
And so when we come back on the other side of the tribulation, spared from the tribulation, there's all these different types of groups there. Like there are these Old Testament saints who died, and now they're resurrected in the great resurrection. There's us, if we were here, who get raptured before the tribulation, and now we get to not die, but also just go to heaven and miss the tribulation. And then we also have people who get saved during the Great Tribulation who walk right into heaven without being raptured or dying. And so the reason I say those three categories is because one of the big places of scriptural support for this is found in the transfiguration of Jesus. And so when Jesus is on that Mount of Transfiguration in the Gospels, what is that, the book of Luke, I think?
Yeah, and Matthew, I think.
He if you remember the story, he's on this mountain with Peter, James, and John. He starts glowing white. It almost looks like the book of Revelation with this great glowing white Jesus. And all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah show up. And so it's Jesus with Moses, Elijah, and the disciples. And people who believe in a pre-tribulational rapture say this is exactly a picture of the book of Revelation, right? We've got a glorified Jesus with an Old Testament saint, Moses, who died and now gets to be resurrected for this moment. A raptured saint, Elijah, who didn't ever have to die, but now he's here with Jesus in this kingdom view. And the disciples who never died, never were raptured, and now they're just standing here. And so they'll say, but man, that's a description of what's going to happen in the book of Revelation, where we're going to be raptured before the Great Tribulation. People get saved during the Great Tribulation. And then at the day of resurrection, you'll have the Old Testament saints, those of us who are raptured, and those who were saved during the tribulation all together in one place. So that's a one place of scriptural support beyond this idea that we are spared from the wrath to come over and over again in the New Testament.
And I know there's another thematic one where the Old Testament prophets believed that Jesus was going to come back in one turn, and yet they even missed that he was going to come back, die on the cross, and then later eventually come back. So if we miss this coming in two parts, perhaps the next coming is going to happen in two parts, right? Another thematic.
Yeah, that's what the seminary I went to was big on pre-tribulational rapture. And that's one of the things they would say all the time is in the same way that Jesus visiting planet Earth was broken up into two parts, his earthly ministry and his second coming, we shouldn't be surprised that his second coming is also broken up into two parts, the coming in rapture and then the coming in the great millennial kingdom and the return of Christ. And so, yeah, it's a two-parter. I kind of push back and ask the question, like, doesn't that mean his first coming was in three parts? But I never had the courage to ask that one in class. Yeah.
Well, if you're looking from Dallas Seminary, there you go.
Yeah, there's a question. Yeah, send us your questions, DTS professors.
Yeah, you might also hear people explaining just like in terms of the wording of everything. So like the parousia is a Greek word for return, meaning the rapture. You might also see apocalypsis, which we talked about earlier, and epiphania used as like the revealing, the final revealing. So there's even that potential split in the words of this, but we can get into semantics all day.
And part of it too, I mean, talking about biblical support, one of the biggest pieces of what folks who believe in a pre-trib rapture, I could say pre-trib, that's like the cool way to say it. Pre-trib rapture might say about the pre-trib rapture is that the word church doesn't appear after the first couple chapters of the book of Revelation. So like, where did the church go? It's like, oh, they were raptured. Again, systematic theology starts with this puzzle piece called rapture we see in Thessalonians and other places and says, where do we put this in the Revelation timeline? Well, if the church is never talked about after chapter 3 or 4 of Revelation, it must happen early on, and the earliest it can happen would be before the Great Tribulation, which makes sense for all these other reasons, they would say.
And as we're just unraveling, all these ideas are popping in because you would think that the return would be like, nobody's going to miss it. And yet you do find evidence throughout the Gospels of like, it seems like it might be like a thief in the night. And so what's the deal with that juxtaposition? You know, is it a thief in the night, or is it like peals of thunder where you look up and you just can't miss it?
Yep. And that's part of what's interesting too, looking at especially in the Gospels of Jesus. On one hand, we have this idea that he's going to come like a thief in the night, and you might see the Left Behind movie or Thief in the Night, the movie, and all of a sudden there's this rapture and he shows up like a thief in the night and you're gone. On the other hand, when you're looking at the passages in the Gospels about when Jesus comes like a thief in the night, it feels like he's coming in judgment like a thief in the night, not in the rapture, but in the wrath of God. This idea that when we read later in like the 7 trumpets, where a third of the earth is wiped out by these angels that come through with their armies, it feels like, well, that's also thief in the night, where judgment comes and 2 might be grinding it on the mill, and you look and the other guy's gone. He's gone because he was wiped out from the face of the earth in judgment. So thief of the night could mean either he comes for us like a thief in the night, or he comes with his judgment like a thief in the night. Thief sounds a little more judgy than salvation-y, but at the same time, that's part of when we think about the second coming of Christ on the clouds with the angels in this glorious way. There's a lot of earthquakes. That's not a thief in the night. You know he's coming if you've read the story. Where if the rapture happens before the Great Tribulation, it's like all of a sudden, right? We're just sitting here doing the podcast, and one of us is gone. I won't say which one it is. One of us is gone. Jesus came like a thief in the night. It's like, oh no, the Great Tribulation is upon us.
You can leave a comment and tell us who you think about.
Who's more likely to be raptured, Danny or AJ?
Well, I know the one thing we put this conversation here before we get into the ending of things, because, like we said, it can begin to cause divergence within the church. Depending which view you take, you can begin to diverge. So my question here is, with this pre-tribulation mindset, how might it affect the way we read what's next? Read the 7 scrolls, read the 7 trumpets, all these different visions happening, the bowls. How does it impact the way we see these events?
I've heard a lot of different things about that. I've heard people say, well, you know what, I don't even read the book of Revelation because I'm not going to be there. I'm going to be raptured before all that happens. It's all a downer anyway. So you know what? I'm just going to pretend that I'm asleep during all that part and I'm not going to study it. I've heard other people say, you know what? I read this and my heart is broken for the world. And I think when the Christians are gone, no wonder no one knows the truth. They're trying to scramble for truth. They can't find it because there's no one there to tell it to them. I need to go and share the gospel with people so that they know what the truth is. I mean, I've seen people, stories of people go full like on geek mode about it too, where it's like they're creating these little like anthologies and autobiographies. In case of rapture, read this, you'll want to know this, that kind of thing. But yeah, you do kind of have to wrestle with, if you believe in a pre-tribulational rapture, at any moment I might be gone and all my Christian friends are going to be gone. What about all those folks who've never heard the gospel or never believed the gospel? They're on their own at that point. So, when you think about just at a a human mortality level, right? If I died, what would happen to my family? Do they know where the passwords to the bank accounts are? That kind of thing. Do they know how to get the life insurance money? All that kind of thing. Think about that at a global level. If all the Christians disappear on one day, who is going to share the gospel with the world? And then you read the next few chapters of Revelation and you think, no wonder all these things go so terribly, is that the presence of the Spirit of God has been removed from the earth as he inhabits his people. And the church is gone. And so all literally hell breaks loose on planet earth.
And what I love about this view is that, there's something about the wrath of God that you see throughout the book of Revelation, throughout the scrolls, the trumpets, the visions, and the bowls coming. And it clearly says in 1 Thessalonians 5, like, God did not appoint us to suffer wrath. 1 Thessalonians 1, Jesus who rescues us from the coming wrath. So the question is, there does seem to be people involved. So we have like the 144,000, the people that are sealed. What do we make of them if the church is completely gone?
Yeah, I
in
think
pre-tribulation rapture.
If you're a pre-tribulation rapture person, you're saying the church is gone. But even thinking practically, right? You've shared Christ with relatives, we've shared Christ with friends. There are people who are right on the verge of believing, and all of a sudden now all their Christian friends are gone. I'm assuming one of the first things they're going to do is get on their knees and say, God, they were right, I was wrong. I need to, did I miss my window, right? And so I think if you're a pre-tribulational rapture person, you're thinking, well, of course, folks are going to start coming to faith. There's going to be some sort of resurgence, especially initially, because people are going to see the Christians were right. Or where did they go? Was it an alien abduction that just got the Christians, right? So I don't know what the people would think, but all the Christians are gone. At some point, that's what the news is going to tell people, or that's what people are going to notice. So, I think that's probably what people see, is that the church disappears and folks are going to come to faith, and God has a way of finding the people that he's chosen for salvation. You might wonder, why didn't he save them before the tribulation, but he saved them after?
So I guess even the question under the question is, as a pre-tribulation position, it's not necessarily married to the 144,000 being literally Israel?
I don't know if it's married to it. I think, if you're coming from a dispensational view, that's the Dallas Seminary view,
right,
and other places, a lot of that is talking about literal Israel. And so what they would say, right, this isn't at a practical level, this is at a biblical level. They'd say, it says 144,000, the full amount of all the 12 tribes of Israel. And so a dispensational theology would believe in a literal future for physical Israel, a literal future for physical Israel. And so folks who are ethnically Israeli or Jewish, those are going to be the ones, they would say, who come to Christ in the midst of the Great Tribulation and be like, oh my gosh, all the Christians are gone. They were right. Jesus is the Messiah. We should follow him. He's the Messiah. And the Jewish people are going to turn to the Messiah, Jesus, and find salvation. If you're a covenant theologian who maybe you have the same end times theology, but you don't necessarily believe in a literal future for physical Israel, you might say it like I said it a few minutes ago, that people come to faith. But a lot of that, the evidence for that position comes in the fact that it's talking about Israel and hope for Israel and Paul's longing for Israel and kind of the centrality of the fullness of God's people in Israel being saved. And even the promise in the Old Testament to Abraham of God's people being his covenant people is a promise that is another puzzle piece in the end times theology. Has God forsaken his people Israel forever, and now he's moved on to the church? Or has the church been grafted into his true people Israel, like what Paul says in Romans? And if so, then where is the salvation of the rest of Israel? When is that going to happen? When is God going to reclaim his covenant people? And so there's this picture in the kingdom on the other side of the end times of the church and Israel together forever in eternity. And so the view would be, hey, well, Israel was God's covenant people in the Old Testament. The church is God's covenant people in the New Testament. And in the Great Tribulation, maybe he reclaims his physical Israel, his covenant people, so that the rest of them might be saved as well. So that's a whole other side effect. I don't think that needs a whole podcast, but Israel or just Christians in general, that's another part of the puzzle.
Yeah, and we talk a little bit more about it in the seven seals of the scroll episode. So if you're jumping to and from episodes, you can jump into that conversation. We've been talking a lot about all of these things. I'm wondering, as you zoom out, look at the pre-tribulation rapture position, what do you think are some of the strengths of the position and maybe some of the weaknesses that you're still asking about the pre-tribulation rapture?
I think the strengths of the position, one is you can map it on pretty well if you use some of this data that we have, the lack of the church in the Great Tribulation, this promise to be spared from the wrath that is to come. I think even that transfiguration picture we talked about, it's like, okay, well then, that might not mean anything, but if it means something, that means it's very significant that,
right.
hey, these are the three types of people. And if there is a rapture, it does, you might even say practically, it feels kind of weird that the church gets raptured into the sky and then just brought right back down again. Like, why,
right.
what's the point? It's like, are you so excited to see Jesus, you float up to see him? Like, why don't you just wait 5 more minutes and he'll be here? So I remember in pre-tribulational classes, the professors would make fun of the post-tribulational people and say, it doesn't even make sense to be raptured and just brought right back down again. If you're going to be raptured, you might as well stay up there for a while, So, hey, that made logical sense
right.
to me when I was in those classes. I think weaknesses, one of the weaknesses of Revelation or of Rapture theology in general is that we don't see it in Revelation anywhere.
Right.
And so in terms of a pre-tribulational rapture thing, you are kind of just shoehorning it in somewhere. And that's a problem with post-tribulational rapture as well. You're shoehorning it in there somewhere. And I think you might poke holes and say, you know what? You can be spared from the wrath that is to come because you're spared from hell. But if you're a post-tribulational person, you would say, no, you're one of the 144,000 that's sealed, and so you miss the wrath. And so when when the great scorpion beasts come during the 7 trumpets, and they go and kill like a third of the Earth's population, or they don't kill, they harm a third of the Earth's population. They only are able to harm those who don't have the mark on their forehead of the 144,000 who are sealed. And so you would say, well, hold on, that's how they're spared from the wrath to come, is that it's happening all around them, and they're almost in this force field where they're protected from all this harm. That's why not all of the earth dies, but only those who are not believers. And so post-trib people might say, no, you're spared from the wrath in the midst of it. And post-trib people will say, where in the scriptures do we see that God's people are spared from suffering, right? They're spared from wrath and damnation, but Christians are always going through suffering, and it's through great trials. So we need to get to the kingdom of God. And even in the 7 seals, in the 5th seal where the martyrs cry out, and they say, how long until you avenge our blood? God says, there are more people who need to die for their faith first. And so there's even a picture that as we go through the tribulation, believers need to die. And we wouldn't say, oh, well, what about being spared from the wrath? We'd say, well, that's the suffering that comes with being a believer. So walking on earth through times of great trial does not mean experiencing the wrath of God. Christians have been martyred for their faith for thousands of years, and they've been spared from the wrath of God. That's their great hope, even in martyrdom. So the folks who argue against a pre-tribulational rapture will say, just because you go through tribulation does not mean the wrath of God has come upon you. That's a great privilege and honor that Christians get to experience sometimes.
Yeah, I was thinking about the strengths and weaknesses myself, and I was thinking of just the timeline of everything where, in a lot of scriptures it says the great hope is of Jesus returning. It's not necessarily the Antichrist coming and then Jesus returning. So it's like following the pattern of set your hope on Jesus returning. So there's the imminency argument of Jesus's return is imminent, and with the rapture, it could happen any moment. And so it's it makes you like those 10 virgins being prepared at any moment. It could happen anytime. There's also, I've heard a lot of interesting things on the millennium, which we'll get to there when we get there.
That's chapter 20, so we got a while.
Yeah. If everybody is raptured out, then it makes you wonder who's actually living in the millennium if you believe in a literal millennium. So there's that argument as well. One of the other pushbacks that I saw that was really interesting was that Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians that the living won't precede the dead. And so you almost have to have a resurrection of the dead believers before any rapture can happen. And then you have to have a resurrection of the saints in the tribulation. And then you have to have a resurrection of the unbelievers that will face all judgment. So it's a threefold resurrection. So I think that was interesting. I find it interesting if that position of if you're going to be out of it, how does that affect your reading, even going through the series? Because it almost feels like you're kind of sitting on the couch watching popcorn as this all goes down. And it's oh man, that's terrible. And so I wonder how that affects your heart posture. So that's kind of the pushbacks that I saw as well in the pre-tribulation rapture. But if you are in this camp or been taught this way and you have further questions, we'd love to have a conversation with you about this. We can send long emails about it, but I think we'd rather sit down with you and have a good research department conversation. Anything to add on pre-trib before we move on to post-trib?
No, I mean, you mentioned the imminency of Christ's return. I think throughout church history and in the scriptures, what we see is the next event on the timeline is the return of Jesus Christ for his church. And that's what we're waiting for. Right? This is what Jesus says as he ascends into heaven in Acts chapter 1. the angel says, why are you looking into the clouds? He's going to come back in the same way. And so we're waiting for the return of Christ.
Right.
And so, yeah, the pre-trib rapture position is like, well, yeah, we are waiting for the return of Christ, but actually we're going to just be sucked up into the air and then we'll return with him. So it's not really what you think. And so that's a real big pushback. We might say, hey, the plain reading of the scriptures is that Christ is going to come back. That's happening next. And it's like, well, technically he's kind of almost coming back and we leave and then we all come back together. It's like, why is that not plain? And so they might ask, how can you say the next event is Christ's return when the next event for you is actually the rapture? So that's really like, well, it's actually broken into 2 parts, or 3. So
interesting. Okay. Pre-trib in the books.
Check.
Let's move on to post-tribulation, the post-tribulation rapture, as opposed to pre-trib. That's broken up into 2 parts, as you just said. Post-trib will say one coming. We got to go through all this mess. And at the very end, we're going to get taken. What does the coming look like? Because I know there's a lot of confusion about that, where in pre-trib, it's pretty clear, like you're meeting Jesus in the clouds, as 1 Thessalonians 4 would say, and you're going to heaven, and then you're going to return back when Jesus finally comes. How do you account for 1 Thessalonians 4, that same passage where we're going to meet Jesus in the clouds, with a post-trib rapture? Like, what does that coming look like?
Yeah, the post-trib rapture position could come in a number of ways. We can say, well, you meet him in the clouds and then you come back with him, right? Kind of like the you and I have talked about that book of Acts passage.
Right.
Did we talk about that on the podcast yet?
Yeah, Acts 28.
Acts 28.
I can read it right here.
Yeah, read it.
All right. There we found some brothers. This is Paul talking about his journey to Rome. We found some brothers and sisters who invited us to spend a week with them. And so we, Paul's camp, came to Rome. The brothers and sisters there at Rome had heard that we were coming, and they traveled as far as the Forum of Appius and the 3 taverns to meet us. So we have a party, Paul's party, and the brothers and sisters in Rome. You can kind of imagine they're coming together and they're meeting each other. At the sight of these people, Paul thanked God and was encouraged. And when we got to Rome, this Paul's party says, Paul was allowed to live by himself with a soldier to guard him. So you can imagine these people coming together and leading them to their destination, to Rome. So that's the Acts passage.
No, I mean, a lot of the terms and even the visual there is a picture of how post-tribulational rapture people understand the rapture. The image I had in my mind is even the story of the prodigal son, where the prodigal son is coming towards the house. Right. The father leaves the porch, runs out, meets the son, and then leads the son back to the house where they come back together. So they're both going different directions. They meet in the middle, then they both return to one place. So the reason we keep belaboring this point is a post-tribulational rapture view will say, well, that's how the rapture is going to happen, is that Christ will be on his way from heaven to earth. We'll see him coming in the clouds. We'll go up and meet him in the clouds, and then together we'll come back with him towards the earth. Almost like I think we're the father meeting the prodigal and coming back to the house, which that's problematic, but that's not the image there. And so he's leading us back to the earth. And so we meet him and then return with him. So that's kind of the image of post-tribulational rapture. I haven't heard if any post-trib people believe this, but I can imagine some people saying, well, it's not literally going to happen this way. Like we don't have to float up into the air and float back. There's this idea that we're going to meet him in the clouds means we don't have to taste death. We're going to be able to walk with him right into the kingdom. And so we're going to go through this great tribulation. We walked through it unscathed. We were not killed. We were not destroyed. And all of a sudden we realize as Christ is coming back, wow, we get to not taste death, but walk right into this new kingdom of his without even having to go through death. And so you still get that same picture of folks who were resurrected from the dead and those of us who didn't taste death together in that great millennium. You don't have all 3, but that could be a picture of what the rapture is an avoidance of death, but walking straight into the kingdom.
And I know we've been looking at a lot of the first century imagery, and a lot of post-rapture people will say it's like the processional entry of any king, where the king comes into a city and then the people of that city kind of go halfway, meet in the procession and follow him into the city or whatever. So you kind of get that first century image. Which on one hand
sounds like this weird semantics trying to make these puzzle pieces fit.
Right.
But I think it's important for us to remember that there are these images that are trying to be painted by the apostles or by Jesus himself as he gives this image, that a lot of these images of Jesus is a king taking his kingdom. And so that is as we're looking at the the 7 trumpets, that's one of the things, as we talk about that next week, that will come out for us, is this idea that at the midpoint of kind of this great wrath season, we see that the tides have turned and the king is starting to build his kingdom. And so seeing him coming in the clouds is us going out to meet our king who's going to take a kingdom. And so, yeah, you almost imagine, right, that Aladdin scene with Prince Ali coming into town or whatever, and all the people are like in line cheering for him.
Yeah.
Just imagine if the king goes through the gates to take a new city, then everybody follows him right through. It's like, that's what you do. You leave the city, meet the king as he's returning from war, whatever it is, and then you follow him back into the city. So that can all be the imagery of this post-trib rapture, is Christ is coming. Some of us will not have to die before we walk into the kingdom. We get to just walk right in and follow our king into this eternal city.
You also find from the post-tribulation camp an argument back against the pre-tribulation camp, saying you can't necessarily divide the two comings. When you get into that semantic division, you get into some trouble, because there are some things where at the rapture event, the parousia, there are things that are described that happen after that, so you can't really have that. But then if you're describing the end of the tribulation with these other different words, apocalyptics, epiphania, you end up with trouble that way. So it's a big semantic debate going on, which if you're interested, we can send you the passages. But my question, similar to the pre-trib rapture, is if you do have a post-tribulation rapture view of Revelation, how is that going to affect your reading of this? Because again, we said at the beginning of this episode that this is a place where a pre-trib and a post-trib can begin to diverge. How does a post-tribulation view of what's happening here in Revelation affect the way you read the 7 scrolls, the trumpets, the visions, and the bowls?
Yeah, if you were here in church last week when we talked about the 7 seals being opened, there was a lot of resonance with this idea that, wow, the world is starting to ache and groan and start these birth pains. And then we're moving to the trumpets and we see the earth starts to fall down on itself. Then we're going to see, right, these things escalating. And we just naturally resonate with that, like, oh my goodness, like this is what's going to happen. The earth is going to be destroyed. Right. There's something in us that resonates with that, with fear and humility and awe, reverence, that kind of thing, that really, if we picture ourselves walking through this great tribulation, we read Revelation in a really sober-minded way, right? Not like sitting on the couch eating popcorn while we watch the world get destroyed like a apocalyptic movie, but more like, oh my goodness, like this world is going to fall apart around us. What if I'm here when the meteors start to fall, or whatever it feels like in real life? And so you do have this sobriety around Revelation where you think, man, this is going to be terrible. But hey, as I go through it, I'm just going to hold fast to my faith and know just 7 years, and then this thing turns around. It's going to get better before it gets worse. We're going to hope it's a literal 7 years and not like 7,000 years. But I think you just kind of prepare yourself to start going through that type of suffering or trial.
Well, in the same way I asked about biblical precedents for pre-tribulation rapture, I wanted to ask biblical precedents on this one, because we do see that God's people are going through a lot of things. They're going through the scrolls. They're going through, the seals of the scroll. They're going through the trumpets. They're going through the bowls. And my question is, I think the pre-tribulation rapture position would say, wait, we're not destined for the wrath of God. That's why he's going to take us out of that. Do we see scriptural precedents for people going through this kind of terrible situations?
Yes.
There we go.
I think there's
simple answer.
A ton of suffering in the New Testament. Think of the book of Acts, which in a sense kind of shows a picture of how the kingdom of Jesus starts to take root on planet Earth. And there's a lot of suffering that happens through God's people as they walk through that season. I think Paul, who teaches about in suffering, I fill up what is lacking in Christ's afflictions. This idea that there's an amount of suffering that needs to grow and become full before the second coming of Christ. I think of the martyrs in the fifth seal who hear that the fullness of martyrdom needs to happen before the second coming of Christ. Like there's all these pictures that there is suffering to be had amongst God's people before the end comes. And in terms of a biblical precedent for us even experiencing the wrath of God, I would point folks to Romans chapter 1, which talks about in this world today, the wrath of God is being revealed against the godlessness and wickedness of humankind, and talks about the fact that in the culture around us, people are being turned over to depravity, depraved minds, depraved acts, while we're standing here among them. So it almost seems like, or this is a micro version of it, but even today, as we look around our culture and we see people being turned towards depravity, this is a view of the wrath of God being revealed on our planet. And we're standing right here. We're not removed from it. We aren't experiencing it ourselves. We aren't given over to depraved minds, but we're here in the midst of it. So that reminds me a lot of in the book of Revelation, where these 144,000 who are sealed are watching this wrath happening around them, and they're here in the midst of it. And so there's a precedent I see there as I look at that as well.
Yeah, and if the pre-tribulation rapture splits the second coming, the split in the post-tribulation is between wrath and tribulation, because they say, hey, it's two different Greek words, right? The wrath, the orge of God, versus the tribulation, the thalipsis of God. And you kind of see it talked about two different ways. And yet I think the Romans 1 passage is so fascinating.
Because that's orge, right?
Right, yeah. And it's the wrath of God from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people, and you're standing in the midst of it. And so I wonder if there's anything with that. But the tribulation passage would say, hey, in Matthew 24, it's talking all about persecution, great distress. It's called the Great Tribulation in Revelation 7. And then the famous one, John 16:33, in this world you will have thalipsis, you will have trouble, tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so I think it's interesting because I think the post-tribulation rapture will look at the sparing, the taking out of the church, and they'd be like, wait, what? Like, we're going to have trouble in this earth. And, you know, they'll even make arguments like, hey, it's not necessarily an escape, but it's, I mean, you think of even Noah in the flood. It's not like he transported himself into heaven. He had to experience the flood. He had to see his friends presumably perish in the flood, yet there was an ark. There was like a ceiling. There was a place where he could go. So,
we think of the 144,000 who are sealed.
Right.
We get a picture of this ceiling, this mark on our forehead that provides us safety from the wrath that comes from the book of Exodus, where on the Passover, the people put this blood on their doorposts and they're sealed. They're saved from this angelic host that's coming through and bringing wrath on all the houses that don't have the mark on it. And so we get all these pictures from the Bible that map onto Revelation, where it's God's people are safe in the midst of the wrath as it flows all around them. I think of the Romans 1 passage kind of shows up in Revelation, where kind of near the middle of the seven trumpets, as things are going crazy, it says, you know, even though these things are going crazy, you'd kind of imagine people would have this turn to Jesus moment. But it says, even though that happened, they didn't glorify God. They kept worshiping idols. They kept on living in sexual immorality. And we get all these images from Romans chapter 1 that almost makes it feel like it's a similar thing, that people aren't turning to God even in the midst of this great tribulation. And so we almost get this picture that in the same way that right now Christians are safe from the wrath of God while it's revealed around us, in Revelation, the Christians will be safe from the wrath of God while the world experiences wrath all around us. I also think of Matthew 24, where Jesus is talking about the end times, and he's talking to the disciples, and it seems like he's trying to equip them to understand it, right? You're going to hear about these wars and rumors. Don't worry about it. The end is still to come. But let's remember, those are the seven seals. That's part of the Great Tribulation. Then he talks about when you see the abomination of desolation, starts talking about you need to run to the hills. Like, who's he talking to? He's talking to the disciples. I thought they were going to be raptured from all that. Why is he equipping them on what to do when they're experiencing the tribulation, the first 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation, if they're not going to be there? We see that mapped on in Revelation, where it talks about the kings and peoples of the earth are going to run into the hills and say, fall on me, I want to die, right? So we're seeing that he's equipping the disciples to live in a season that later a pre-trib person would say, well, they're not even going to be there for. So then why is Jesus equipping them on what to do in that moment? When you see the abomination of desolation, the disciples might raise their hand and be like, actually, we won't, because we'll be raptured. So it's interesting. I mean,
Yeah. And one of the passages that I wanted to read, Luke 21, verse 36, it says, be always on the watch and pray that you may be able to escape all that is about to happen, and that you may be able to stand before the Son of Man. And obviously the big debate is, what does escape mean?
Escape in rapture or escape the wrath so that you can stand on the other side of the tribulation?
A lot of, again, semantic discussions happen around this one word. But, I think of John 17 as well in terms of post-tribulation. My prayer is that is not that you take them out of the world, but you protect them from the evil one. The same word is protect, tereo, keep, is used in Revelation 3:10, talking to the church of Philadelphia. I will also keep you from that hour. So there's an element of like protection. Anyway, that's there. So,
and I do want to point out too, it's interesting, you know, if you're sitting there listening to this podcast or watching on YouTube and you're thinking, well, man, maybe the Bible has these errors in it, whatever. It's fascinating to me. I've never heard a single person say, I don't trust the Bible as reliable because of all of this garbage going on with Revelation and Apocalypse, and nobody can agree on it. Because I think what we need to understand is that apocalyptic literature is by nature very difficult to understand.
Right.
That nobody knows, right? Even the Old Testament prophecy, it makes total sense looking backwards. But when you're reading in the Old Testament times, they were having a really hard time trying to figure out who the Messiah was supposed to be. They got it completely wrong, even though they had 1,000 theological debates like this.
Right.
And so, you know, I've heard people say, I don't trust the reliability of Scripture for this reason, that reason. I've never heard them say, because of all the different views on Revelation. Because I think even there's this common understanding that apocalyptic literature is almost impossible to put together perfectly as a puzzle here in our human form, especially looking into the future. And so really we're speculating, we're working, we're doing this due diligence, which is important. Peter talks about that with the Old Testament prophecy. It's important, but this isn't one of those things that you've got to get it right.
Yeah.
It's something that it's important to wrestle with because it's part of the scriptures, but and it affects how we live, but it's not one of those things that should shake your faith that we don't know exactly how these puzzle pieces fit. Right. That's how apocalyptic literature works.
And it almost illuminates the phrase, no one knows the hour. No one knows the hour. So before we jump into some of the alternate theories, let's talk about post-trib as we zoom out. Strengths and weaknesses of post-tribulation rapture. What do you see?
Yeah, strengths of post-trib is it maps on with some of these passages like a Matthew 24 where Jesus is equipping them to go through the tribulation, like these thematic things we've talked about where God is not sparing us from tribulation, though he spares us from wrath. The imagery from the Old Testament that shows how God's people are in the midst of wrath, but saved from it, like in the Exodus or even like in Romans chapter 1. Those are some of those strengths that it maps on really well with that. And just the simplicity of that means for us, if we believe in a post-trib rapture, we know the next thing that's going to happen is Jesus is coming on the clouds like a thief in the night and boom, like it's going to happen. And there's not going to be this two-part coming. It's his second coming will be his second coming, not his technically his second A or his 2 of 3, right? But it's his literal second coming. So there's a simplicity of that. I think the downside with a post-trib rapture is you might have some question marks about some of those puzzle pieces where you're like, well, what do you do with this one? What do you do with what do you do with this other one? Like, you know, and so we've talked about those already, but
big one being imminency, right? The imminency of Jesus.
Of Jesus coming and comes next. Yes.
Do we have to wait for all these signs to happen and then Jesus comes back?
Because it doesn't feel like a thief in the night if we've experienced 7 years of things that we knew that were going to happen because the Bible said it was going to happen. It's like, okay, just set your clock 1 more year and then Jesus comes back. It doesn't feel like that's the imminence that's the next thing happening. So yeah, pre-trib, we'll be sitting here and then boom, we're raptured. Post-trib, it's like the sky's been falling for 7 years and we're like, Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. Feels like the next thing that's going to happen is the sky is falling, not Jesus is coming back.
Right. So I got a couple more important questions. The first one being alternate theories.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of this episode, we said we're going to put on our futurist hat because everything we've been talking about assumes futurism. What about the preterist view? What about the view that says, hey, this stuff has already happened? Where do you see strengths and weaknesses in the preterist view? And then there's one more on the table, which is mid-tribulation.
Oh, wow.
What do you think about mid-tribulation as well as the preterist? These are the alternate ones that don't get much airtime.
Yeah,
so we don't have to spend too much time.
No, but again, the preterist view is that many of the events of the book of Revelation have already happened. They happened in the first century, perhaps. And I think the strength of the preterist view is that there's a lot of connection between what you see in Revelation and what happens in the first century, right? You may have heard theories like the number 666, which comes out in Revelation as we're kind of talking about the chapters 12 through 18 there. 666 is this number in kind of Roman theory that maps with Nero and this great and terrible emperor who went to destroy God's people and lit them on fire and did all these. There was a great tribulation that happened under Nero's reign. Right, we've talked a little bit about the reign of Domitian and how that maps on to some of the things that happened, and inflation under the reign of Domitian that looks like the inflation that we see in Revelation chapter 5 through 8, or 6 through 8. I read something today that was talking about these Jewish soldiers in this great war against Rome that would dress up as females with long hair and makeup, and yet they were these cutting soldiers who had these swords hidden in their cloaks, and they'd come and they'd kill people. And someone mapped that onto the scorpions that we read about in Revelation chapter, 8, 9, something like that.
Yeah, somewhere in there. That
have these scorpions that come from the earth that have long flowing hair like women and faces like humans, but have this tail that sneaks out and stings you.
Interesting.
And so well, that maps onto that, right? And so a lot of it is somebody had said, hey, you know what? I think Revelation is written in coded language to be able to equip God's people to understand how to thrive in this reign of Nero and the reign of Domitian, these different emperors, without being a document. If a Roman soldier picked it up and read it, he'd be like, this reads like a J.R.R. Tolkien novel. This is crazy. He wouldn't think you guys are trying to overthrow the government. And so it's coded language on purpose, right? Other people just believe it's apocalyptic imagery, but apocalyptic imagery that happened in the first century. So if you're reading it from a preterist view, the question would be, well, when's the rapture? It didn't happen. Right? So before we just throw out the preterist view because the rapture didn't happen, I think it's important to point out that rapture theology, like we've been talking about on this podcast, really didn't become popularized until the 19th
century,
or 20th century, like early 1900s. Yeah. And before then, the church didn't have a quantified rapture theology. They believed that Christ was coming back. That was the next thing that was going to happen. And so all those things we've talked about today about the imminence of Christ's return, they believed that. The rapture theology was something that was built in a season like modernity in the 1920s, kind of going to the scriptures and saying, this thing is literally true. Let's pull out all the puzzle pieces, do some systematic theology and figure out how it all works. Where before that, the scripture was experienced a little bit differently, not with our modern minds who feel like there needs to be an answer to every puzzle piece, but with these minds that just feel like, well, we can kind of see these themes that Christ is coming back. It's going to be crazy, but ultimately he wins. He's victorious. And so the preterist view does jive with most of church history, which did not believe in a literal rapture, would be sucked up into the clouds. And so don't just cast it aside because there wasn't a rapture. Preterists might have a different view of what rapture looks like, but the rapture, as we've been talking about it today, has only existed for the last 100 of the last 2,000 years. And so, don't throw out the preterist baby with the bathwater because of the lack of rapture.
And I love listening to preterists talk because they're just so historical in nature. Like they dive into history, they see all the imagery, and it's been really fun so far in the series looking at the history and seeing, man, this really maps onto the first century. And yet when I listen to preterists, I always wind up hearing partial preterism because at some point,
this hasn't happened
yet.
At
some point, it hasn't happened yet. They're always pushing to we got to wear our futurist hat now.
And in a sense, every preterist I know is a partial preterist because part of partial preterism is like, well, I don't believe Jesus has come back yet. And so that's a partial preterist view. And so you don't believe everything in Revelation has already happened. But that line of where is future and where has already happened is a little bit blurred amongst preterist camps. But I will give them that, when you look at what happened in the first century and even Jesus equipping the disciples to go through this season, it makes a lot more sense if the disciples literally went through that season. Right? Jesus' teachings in Matthew 24 starts with Jesus saying, look at the temple, this thing's going to be torn down. And the disciples said, wait, what? What's that going to look like? When are you coming back? And then Jesus preaches Matthew chapter 24, which looks exactly like Revelation chapter 5 through 10 or whatever it is. And so we get this picture that it seems like in Matthew 24, Jesus is talking about the season where the temple is destroyed and his coming is him setting up this new company, this new kingdom. Babylon is destroyed. That's the Roman Empire. And then this new Western civilization is born. That could be Constantine in the 4th century. And so a lot of Revelation can map onto world events up to the probably mid 300s AD. And so it's a pretty compelling way to look at the book of Revelation. One big reason that you kind of can throw away preterism sometimes is most preterists believe that Revelation was written in the 50s and 60s AD, because the Jerusalem didn't fall until 70 AD. But most historical theologians believe that it was actually written in the late 90s. And so you're like, wait, hold on. why do you believe it was written in the 50s? Like, well, because a lot of this stuff didn't happen until the 70s. Like, well, you can't just change the date of all the other shit because of your interpretation, right? And so that's why we've talked a little bit about on this podcast that, okay, if I were a preterist and I believe that this talks about events that happened in the first century and beyond, I probably still believe it was written in the 90s, but I believe that John was taken by that angel to see kind of what unfolded starting at the ascension of Jesus Christ. And so he got to see a little bit of the spiritual perspective of what's happened over the last 30 years. And then he gets to kind of see what goes on from here. So I don't know if that's a real preterist view, but if I forced myself to be a preterist, I'd have to be that kind of preterist because I think the book was written in the late 90s.
Well, awesome. We'll push pause on the mid-tribulation because I know that's coming up in the next question.
Oh, okay.
Because the next question is, where do Pastor Danny and Pastor AJ land on this issue?
Are you saying that we land on mid-trib?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to talk a little bit about mid-trib in my answer. But my question, I think it's really important to let people know, just like, okay, where does Pastor Danny land? Because I think as they're listening to you on Sundays, it does really help figure out where your head is and where you're trying to lead our people, because it is so divergent sometimes. Is it preterist? Is it pre-trib? Is it post-trib? And it can affect your reading of what we're about to read. So up until about like verse 9 or chapter 19, I would say. So where are you at?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit in the podcast. The school that I did my master's degree in was a very pre-tribulational rapture school, kind of the birthplace of dispensational theology and revelation charts. If you learned it all about Revelation in the 80s or 90s, you probably learned something that came out of Dallas Seminary. Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. All these different things came out of Dallas Seminary. And so all of my education is around a futurist view of Revelation with a pre-tribulational rapture and a premillennial return of Christ before the 1,000-year reign. We haven't even talked about premillennialism yet.
Oh, we'll get there.
We'll get there in a few weeks. But so that's where my training comes in. So I naturally see all this stuff with those eyes. I think where I'm skeptical about a pre-tribulational or futurist classically view of Revelation is sometimes I feel like we're trying too hard to make all these puzzle pieces fit when they weren't designed to be puzzle pieces to fit. They were designed to paint a picture. And so I've been resonating a lot with the preterist theologians as I go through Revelation in terms of their reading of Revelation. It makes the most sense to me. We recommend Alistair Roberts' online commentary of Revelation in our notes every week. Every week I listen to his stuff. I'm like, this is amazing. But at the same time, as I kind of do the historical work on mapping it with first century events, I'm always like, I don't know, because I kind of feel like part of the futurist reading is saying, hey, the way to experience Revelation is telling these people, remember what we experienced when Rome came and destroyed the temple, when our empire was under siege? Well, in the end of times, it's going to be like that, but much, much worse. And so there's this already but not yet eschatology that we've seen a glimpse of this, but this is just the beginning of the birth pains. And that for me really relates to the theme of Revelation and Jesus' teachings on the end times, is that this is a small version, but it's going to be bigger and bigger, and the end is yet to come. I don't look at Constantine creating Christianity as the one world religion and the fall of the Roman Empire as like Revelation 20, now the kingdom of Christ is here on earth. That feels like a stretch to me. And so I have a hard time moving into the preterist camp. And yet, as we talk about it, there's some of those logical pieces with a premillennial rapture where we just disappear, where I think it's hard for me to believe in a theology that's only been around for 100 years. Like, I love to ask, what did the church fathers believe about this? What did the apostles believe about this? It didn't seem like the apostles or the church fathers had a rapture on their mind. And so it's hard for me to just believe in a premillennial rapture or pre-tribulational rapture when it feels like that's a 1920s invention due to modernity. And so anyway, so I guess I'm saying that I'm wrestling through it myself, but the more we go through Revelation, the more that you kind of have to start making choices. And as I'm preparing the sermon for next week right now, I'm thinking, man, the farther we get through this great tribulation, we got to talk about, is this happening in the past or the future? That kind of thing. So one thing that's been interesting is that as we've walked through this study, we have walked through it just asking the question over and over again, what would it feel like to be in the church of Sardis or Laodicea or Philadelphia hearing this message? And that is dependent on how you interpret Revelation, but that actually has really helped me to inform how I preach through it. So if you listen to the Seven Seals message, you'll see that I wasn't like hitting hard on futurism, but in a sense I kind of am kind of talking about, hey, what we're experiencing is going to grow over time and we have a glimpse of it. It's coming more. So I feel like I'm probably futurist leaning in Revelation interpretation. Today, the postmillennial view seems the best to me in our conversation. but all my training just keeps pushing me back to premillennialism. So again, if you're not decided either, that's fine. I think that's how apocalyptic literature works, is understanding all the strengths of the position. So I'm kind of hovering in that triangle right now.
Yeah. And I know
I haven't thought about mid-trib though, so I'm excited for you to see
all of
what
our pastors have had to land on this in one of our documents.
Yeah. So
ordination.
If you go on our website, you can read our doctrinal statement. We believe that Christ is returning, and there's different things that we say that we all agree on, but every pastor who's ordained has to create a doctrinal statement, and we allow a variety of views on Revelation. So I don't feel like stressed like I got to get an answer or resign or something. It's, if I change my answer, I might need to amend my doctrinal statement. You were ordained most recently, so hopefully yours still match up with your own. But I was ordained here at the church, 15 years ago. So, nothing has changed in my core theology, but as we talk about some of these issues that are debatable and nuanced, I wonder if I would still 100% agree with what I wrote down 15 years ago as these conversations have taken place.
Yeah. So I guess full disclosure time for me.
Yeah. Here we go. Okay.
So
is this you resigning? Is this what's the first thing? Like, I don't believe Jesus is coming back.
No, remember, I'm getting raptured on the comments, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the preterist reading is really compelling, but I think it goes back to that image that we drew out. Eva Alvarez, shout out to you, drew in the first episode, where these images that happen either in the first century or whatever's going on get taken up into this cloud that becomes timeless in nature. And so what you see is this idea that historical ideas or historical events get transposed into these images that have this timeless language to them. And so I find it not contradictory to read preterist, like this is all happening in the first century, but also lean futurist, because I think it's communicating those things. And so when I think about that, I lean post-tribulation. That's kind of where my heart is, but I've been really compelled by mid-tribulation.
Now, what draws you in? So, because I've always heard that the mid-tribulation people are just the people who can't make up their minds. So they're like, let's just compromise. It's in the middle somewhere.
So I think the mid-tribulation has been espoused based on when the wrath of God comes. Because I want to hold to the fact that, yes, we do go through great tribulations in this world, but I want to also hold on to the fact that we don't go through the wrath. And for the longest time, I thought that, okay, we're going to go through it all, and then like we're going to be post-trib, we're going to meet him in the processional. But like I've been scooting my wrath a little bit earlier and earlier.
Okay.
And so I don't know. I see a couple problems in the sense that if the church isn't there, I just wonder, like, if I was a first century reader and I had this idea that I'm not going to even be there, I don't know how encouraging the letter is to me anymore. It's like a little bit passive to me. And, then you end up with this idea that, okay, maybe it's converts, maybe it's the Jewish state or whatever's happening with the 144,000. And you're thinking to yourself, okay, if it's Israel, I just spent the entire New Testament talking about how the church and Israel are being grafted into the same root. And so I'm a little hesitant to say all of a sudden the church gets swept to the side and then Israel comes. And then I think like, even if they are converts, like the uniting thing of the 144,000 is that they have to come to Christ. And so it makes me wonder, like, if God knew who was going to come to Christ, if he foreknew all that and could see it, like he's timeless, did he truly rapture his church? Because there's still believers there. And so that's kind of what I've been wondering. And so I see this motif of like, hey, in every generation that's going through all this, we're going to see people that are alive and sealed. But the one character that I keep missing, that I am still mulling over, is death itself. And whenever people talk about to rapture, to me, of like, in one day they're going to be here and the next day they're not, I wonder if that's like, I've heard a lot of stories of people dying and that's their story. It's like one day they're healthy and then all of a sudden.
Are you saying death is rapture?
Perhaps. Perhaps. This is sort of my mulling over. I'm thinking like, man, what if the language of rapture is actually just another way of like, yeah, we're being transported into another realm when we die. We meet Jesus. I wonder. Anyway.
All the views, I hear all these different people in my life screaming at me quietly in my headphones while I think through all these views. I'm thinking like, well, what about Israel? When you talk about the church is going to be there. Like, no, the church is gone. The church is different than Israel, Or when you're talking about, death being rapture. Like, what about Elijah? He's the raptured saint for the Old Testament.
Right,
So
right.
it's any position that we take,
There's always going to be questions.
there's always going to be questions, and there's going to be people saying that we missed something huge.
Yeah.
That's the nature of apocalyptic literature.
And so I'm reading the scrolls. I'm hearing Matthew 24. I'm hearing things that people go through. I'm seeing the 144,000 as like the church sealed, the believer sealed, and then the multitude that happens in Revelation 7 of like the people that have died, that have gone before us. So you have people that are alive, people that have died and are in the throne. You see the trumpets, you see the escalation of the end times events. So I'm thinking that we're probably going to have to go through that, because we do see the sealed people being tormented by the scorpion beasts, whatever they are, in the fifth trumpet. And then you see this measuring of the temple. So that's kind of like another way of saying like, hey, these people are alive and sealed. And then you see these two witnesses, which I've heard a lot of arguments back and forth of like, who are these two witnesses? I would say they're representative of people that have gone before us and witnessed and have died and have resurrected. So again, we see like alive and dead. And now finally, I'll end it on this. Here's where mid-tribulation gets really interesting, because there's a scene where John eats a scroll. And then there's a passage that says this in Revelation 10:7, in the days when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished, just as he announced to his servants and the prophets. That statement has haunted me throughout reading this, because the next time you see the 144,000, they're celebrating. They're on Mount Zion. And then all of a sudden they're before the throne, they're before the Lamb, they're singing a song that nobody knows. So it's like the 144,000 get to go through this. They're singing a song that nobody knows. And it says literally that they're redeemed from earth. I don't know. That sounds a lot like taking 144,000, the people sealed, and bringing them to a new realm. And then you get the bowls. And the bowls, the wrath language gets turned up. And I wonder if the wrath has been preserved until that time.
Until they're gone.
Yeah, until they're gone. And then the bowls of wrath, there's no interlude. It just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It gets it done with, and then you end up with the end times.
Well, and honestly, because it's right at that point, right before the 144,000 are praising and all that, we have this near the end of the seven trumpets. It's terrible. These two witnesses die. They raise again. They're taken back to heaven. And it's kind of like all is lost. All hope is lost. And then you turn the page and it's like, we're praising because the kingdom of Jesus is coming. It's like, wait, no, all hope is lost. Why are we so happy? It seems like earth just got worse. And then the wrath is coming. Like,
the only thing that's happened in between then is the seventh trumpet has sounded. And at the seventh trumpet, there's going to be some sort of mystery fulfilled.
And that's what the rapture is, at the sound of the trumpet.
That's right.
It's
wow. 1 Corinthians 15. Listen, I tell you a mystery.
What if we
will not all
rose
sleep,
with those two witnesses?
but we will all be changed in the flash, the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So I've been really intrigued by this mid-tribulation rapture. I do think we're going to go through something.
Mid-tribulation, yeah. I'm making air quotes on YouTube, rapture. Because maybe it's just, they all die. Maybe. I kind of like that. I got to rewrite my sermon for next week now.
Yeah. Anyway, that's sort of where I am. I can wrestle with all these things. But
and now you guys can too.
We invite you to wrestle with us. I'm open to interpret. I think there's a couple things that I've already learned throughout this journey, starting from week 1 all the way to now. So I'm super grateful to have this space to wrestle with all these things. We made it.
We made it.
Rapture episode. Pastor Danny, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you soon.